UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain, this is Democracy Now!
In just 3 weeks, we will enter a new decade. A decade that will define our future. Right now, we are desperate for any sign of hope. Well, I tell you, there is hope. I have seen it. But it does not come from the governments or corporations. It comes from the people.
16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg addresses world leaders here in Madrid just hours before being named Times Person of the Year. We'll hear her full UN address. Just hours after Greta's speech, hundreds of climate activists are ushered out of the conference center by police.
This is exactly what has been happening across the world. We have been shut out and we have not been heard. We the people, have been kept out while the very polluters who drive this crisis are kept in.
We'll hear voices from the protests and speak with Vanessa Nakate, the first Fridays for Future climate striker in Uganda. Then we look at ground zero of the climate crisis, the Marshall Islands.
We've been told that if we want to stay in our islands, we'd have to adapt and elevate. And with migration as the only plan B, we're having to deal with these issues that we in the first place...
We will also speak to poet Kathy Jetnell Kitchener of the Marshall Islands. She is the daughter of the president of the Marshall Islands. All that and more coming up. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain. The European Commission has proposed a sweeping new plan to address the climate crisis. The European Green Deal would be the biggest overhaul of European policy since the foundation of the modern European Union system. This is EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
We do not have all the answers yet. Today is the start of a journey. But this is Europe's man on the moon moment.
The European Green New Deal would seek to have Europe become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. It would also seek to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. European leaders are discussing the emissions goals at a summit in Brussels today. Environmentalists here at COP25 in Madrid, Spain, welcomed the plan, but said it doesn't go far enough in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. This is Greenpeace campaigner Martin Kaiser.
The new Green Deal proposed by the Commission today is not the adequate answer to the climate emergency we see already in Europe.
Back in the United States, Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee Wednesday, where he reiterated his report's key finding that the FBI's opening of an investigation into President Trump's 2016 campaign aides was not politically motivated. During the hearing, Republican lawmakers slammed the FBI over the myriad errors the report revealed about the FBI's process of seeking approval to surveil former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. These applications were filed to the secret FISA court created by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Civil liberty experts have long warned of the court's unaccountable and secretive nature for approving domestic surveillance, especially against Muslims. This is Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz.
We found, and as we outline here, are deeply concerned that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by 3 separate hand-picked investigative teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations after the matter had been briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, even though the information sought through the use of FISA authority related so closely to an ongoing presidential campaign, and even though those involved with the investigation knew that their actions would likely be subjected to close scrutiny.
Inspector General Michael Horowitz also pushed back on Attorney General William Barr's statement Monday, claiming the FBI should not have opened the 2016 investigation in the first place. In West Africa, over 70 troops were killed in an attack on a military camp in Niger near the border with Mali. It's the deadliest attack on Nigerian military in recent history. No one's taken responsibility for the attack so far, but Islamist militants have carried out a string of attacks across the Sahel region in West Africa so far this year. The attack came only days before a planned security summit in France between the presidents France, Niger, and 4 other West African leaders. The summit has now been postponed. France has at least 4,500 troops deployed to the Sahel region. In Algeria, mass demonstrations rocked the country Wednesday as protesters demanded the cancellation of today's national election to replace Algeria's longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced from power by a mass uprising in April.
I won't vote because these elections themselves are a betrayal. Everyone who votes is committing a betrayal against our country because the summit of stupidity is to try the same experience with the same people and tools and expect a different result.
Extremely low turnout at the polls is expected today amidst widespread calls to boycott the election, with demonstrators saying that all the candidates are part of Algeria's long-ruling elite. And the country is headed toward its 3rd national election in a year, after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and rival Benny Gantz both failed to form a governing coalition. The election will be held on March 2nd. The political chaos in Israel comes as Netanyahu is also facing charges in 3 criminal corruption cases. In France, workers are vowing to continue their strike after French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe gave a televised address outlining the proposed pension overhaul. Philippe claimed the legal retirement age would remain 62, although the proposed change would effectively raise the retirement age to 64 for all people born after 1974. Union leaders called the raising of the retirement age a red line, and many rail lines and schools remain shuttered today amidst mass protests across France. Police unions have also joined the strike, which now stretches into its 2nd week. Here in Madrid, Spain, at COP25, the UN Climate Summit, hundreds of activists gathered Wednesday outside the conference's main plenary halls to demand rich countries take more drastic action to address the climate crisis. Activists report being pushed and forced out of the building. Security. More than 300 protesters were forced outside. A number had their credentials temporarily removed. We'll have a full report on the protests later in the broadcast. Disgraced Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein and the board of his now bankrupt company have reached a tentative $25 million settlement with dozens of women who've accused him of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. The deal would not require Weinstein to admit any wrongdoing, nor would Weinstein have to pay any of his own money to the dozens of actresses and female employees who've accused him of serial rape and sexual harassment. Weinstein is also facing criminal sexual assault charges in New York and is scheduled to attend court in early January. The Federal Trade Commission's reached the largest ever settlement with a for-profit college, the University of Phoenix, over charges of deceptive advertising and marketing false job opportunities to students. The university's record $191 million settlement will include canceling $141 million in student debt. FTC member Rohit Chopra said, quote, "Today's action against the University of Phoenix and future actions against scam schools will set the stage for canceling more student debt," unquote. President Trump signed a highly controversial executive order Wednesday aimed at cracking down on the growing boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS. The global nonviolent movement seeks to pressure Israeli government over its treatment of Palestinians. Trump's executive order will direct federal agencies to adopt a new definition of anti-Semitism to include criticisms of Israel, and then to penalize college campuses and universities and allow for conversations and debate about the Israeli government. Many prominent American Jewish groups oppose the executive order, even though it claims to protect Jews and rising anti-Semitism worldwide. The Jewish group J Street said the order is designed to have a, quote, chilling effect on free speech, unquote. Other Jewish groups that said Trump himself has fostered anti-Semitism and frequently repeated anti-Semitic tropes, and that this executive order is more about the administration's support for Israel than to protect American Jews. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has again attempted to issue fines as large as $500,000 against immigrants who've taken sanctuary in churches across the country to resist their deportations. ICE sent warning letters to 7 immigrants threatening them with fines and criminal prosecution. This comes after it tried to issue fines last summer but had to revoke them. David Benyon, an attorney at Free Migration Project working with some of the sanctuary leaders, said the fines are unconstitutional because they restrict freedom of speech and violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Unless I really had to. But then I found a reason to speak. Since then, I've given many speeches and learned that when you talk in public, you should start with something personal or emotional to get everyone's attention. Say things like, our house is on fire, I want you to panic, or how dare you. But today I will not do that. Because then those phrases are all that people focus on. They don't remember the facts, the very reason why I say those things in the first place. We no longer have time to leave out the science. For about a year, I have been constantly talking about our rapidly declining carbon budgets over and over again. But since that is still being ignored, I will just keep repeating it. In Chapter 2, on page 108 in the SR 1.5 IPCC report that came out last year, it says that if we are to have a 67% chance of limiting the global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we had on January 1st, 2018, 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in that budget. And of course, that number is much lower today, as we emit about 42 gigatons of CO2 every year, including land use. With today's emissions levels, that remaining budget will be gone within about 8 years. These numbers aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science. Though many scientists suggest these figures are too moderate, these are the ones that have been accepted through the IPCC. And please note that these figures are global and therefore do not say anything about the aspect of equity, which is absolutely essential to make the Paris Agreement work on a global scale. That means that richer countries need to do their fair share and get down to real zero emissions much faster, and then help poorer countries do the same, so people in less fortunate parts of the world can raise their living standards. These numbers also don't include most feedback loops, non-linear tipping points, or additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution. Most models assume, however, that future generations will somehow be able to suck hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 out of the air with technologies that do not exist in the scale required and maybe never will. The approximate 67% chance budget is the one with the highest odds given by the IPCC. And now we have less than 340 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in that budget to share fairly. And why is it so important to stay below 1.5 degrees? Because even at 1 degree, people are dying from the climate crisis. Because that is what the United Science calls for to avoid destabilizing the climate, so that we have the best possible chance to avoid setting off irreversible chain reactions, such as melting glaciers, polar ice, and thawing Arctic permafrost. Every fraction of a degree matters. So there it is again. This is my message. This is what I want you to focus on. So please tell me, how do you react to these numbers without feeling at least some level of panic? How do you respond to the fact that basically nothing is being done about this without feeling the slightest bit of anger? And how do you communicate this without sounding alarmist? I would really like to know. Since the Paris Agreement, global banks have invested $1.9 trillion in fossil fuels. 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. The G20 countries account for almost 80% of total emissions. The richest 10% of the world's population produce half of our CO2 emissions, while the poorest 50% account for just 1/10. We indeed have some work to do, but some more than others. Recently, a handful of rich countries pledged to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases by so and so many percent by this or that date, or to become climate neutral or net zero in so and so many years. This may sound impressive at first glance, but even though the intentions may be good, this is not leadership. This is not leading, this is misleading. Because most of these pledges do not include aviation, shipping, and imported and exported goods and consumption. They do, however, include the possibility of countries to offset their emissions elsewhere. These pledges don't include the immediate yearly reduction rates needed for wealthy countries, which is necessary to stay within the remaining tiny budget. Zero in 2050 means nothing if high emission continues even for a few years, then the remaining budget will be gone. Without seeing the full picture, we will not solve this crisis. Finding holistic solutions is what the COP should be all about. But instead, it seems to have turned into some kind of opportunity for countries to negotiate loopholes and to avoid raising their ambition. Countries are finding clever ways around having to take real action, like double counting emissions reductions and moving their emissions overseas, and walking back on their promises to increase ambition, or refusing to pay for solutions or loss and damage. This has to stop. What we need is real, drastic emission cuts at the source. But of course, just reducing emissions is not enough. Our greenhouse gas emissions has to stop. To stay below 1.5 degrees, we need to keep the carbon in the ground. Only setting up distant dates and saying things which give the impression of that action is underway will most likely do more harm than good, because the changes required are still nowhere in sight. The politics needed does not exist today, despite what you might hear from world leaders. And I still believe that the biggest danger is not inaction. The real danger is when politicians and CEOs are making it look like real action is happening, when, in fact, almost nothing is being done, apart from clever accounting and creative PR. have been fortunate enough to be able to travel around the world. And my experience is that the lack of awareness is the same everywhere, not the least amongst those elected to lead us. There is no sense of urgency whatsoever. Our leaders are not behaving as if we were in an emergency. In an emergency, you change your behavior. If there's a child standing in the middle of the road and cars are coming at full speed, you don't look away because it's too uncomfortable. You immediately run out and rescue that child. And without that sense of urgency, how can we, the people, understand that we are facing a real crisis? And if the people are not fully aware of what is going on, then they will not put pressure on the people in power to act. And without pressure from the people, our leaders can get away with basically not doing anything, which is where we are now. And around it goes. In just 3 weeks, we will enter a new decade. A decade that will define our future. Right now, we are desperate for any sign of hope. Well, I'm telling you, there is hope. I have seen it. But it does not come from the governments or corporations. It comes from the people. The people who have been unaware but are now starting to wake up. And once we become aware, we change. People can change. People are ready for change. And that is the hope, because we have democracy. And democracy is happening all the time, not just on election day, but every second and every hour. It is public opinion that runs the free world. In fact, every great change throughout history has come from the people. We do not have to wait. We can start the change right now. We, the people. Thank you.
That's 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Right after her address, scores of youth activists rushed the stage as security tried to escort them off. They stood immovable, fists raised in the air, chanting, "You can't drink oil, keep it in the soil." Their final chant as they walked off the stage was, "We are unstoppable. Another world is possible." The UN summit plenary on Thursday afternoon. We'll hear voices from the protests that took place that afternoon and speak with Uganda's first Fridays for Future climate striker. She was there on the stage in the morning, and she was pushed outside as she protested with others in the afternoon. We'll be speaking with future climate striker Vanessa Nakate. Stay with us.
Rise before the CEEs, we rise as tall as trees. We rise not just for you and me, but for all humanity. Rise before the CEEs, we rise as tall as trees. We rise not just for you and me, but for all humanity. We rise, rise for liberation. We rise, rise for liberation. We rise, rise for all creation. We rise, rise for all creation. We rise before the CEEs. Rise before the CEEs. We rise as tall as trees. We rise as tall as trees. We rise not just for you and me. We rise not just for you and me, but for all humanity. But for all humanity. We rise.
Now out. She was their choice for Person of the Year. Hundreds of activists gathered to demand rich countries take more drastic action to address the climate crisis. The protests began just as we were finishing our live broadcast. Right now, the protesters are walking by us, by Tom and Corrine. Security opened up what looks like a large garage door. They're holding the front person who's got his hand up in a fist, and now hundreds of people are passing us as they walk out of the cop. As they walk out of the cop, it's not clear why they're walking out of the cop. But what they're doing, Tom, why don't you explain?
There's a possibility that they're going to lose their badges.
Tom is afraid that they will lose their badges if they walk out of the cop.
My name is Rita Waka. I'm from Nigeria. I represent Friends of the Earth. We want sustainable solutions. We want people power solutions. We want solutions that connect the people to the ground. There are a lot of devastation in communities in different landscapes across the world. People are dying every day for sins they did not commit. And we are here to say, no more corruption with our COP. We want the people's voice to be heard. We want a climate just solution. We don't want carbon markets. We want people power solutions. And that's what we're